Sometimes you get to introduce a friend, and those are the introductions that mean the most to me. Wade Davis is indeed a friend, a colleague of 2 decades. There is a lot that I can say about Wade, but he does a much better job than I in sharing stories, which we are about to hear. But before I turn it over to Wade Davis, and before we give to Wade the very special honorary degree, of which he has a number of doctorates, by the way, but he only has 1 honorary master's that he is about to get. So this is his most special degree. But before I turn it over to him, I want to share one vignette from the east face of Mount Everest, where Wade and I were doing research many years ago, and we've been there several times. It's a lot of work to get over into the Gama Valley on the east face of Everest, and you get pretty tired at the end of the day. Well, most people, when they came into camp, would go for the mug of warm tea. They might find their air mattress to lie down on. But every day when we got into camp, I would look around for Wade. And where was he? He wasn't with the rest of us. He wasn't sitting on the air mattress. He wasn't looking for the warm tea. Invariably, I would find Wade in the yak herders camp. And Wade was talking to them. What does it mean to be a yak herder? What does it mean to live on this mountain? What does it mean in terms of your life and in terms of your place? Since Wade's earliest days growing up in British Columbia, he has been looking for the meaning of people and place. He has followed it as a scholar. He's followed it as an adventurer. He was an explorer in residence here at the National Geographic for a number of years. But most importantly, he has followed it because through that meaning and through his writing, he presents to all of us a wider lens on what it means to be people on this wonderful place that we call the Earth. An Earth that he knows extremely well, having straddled it and described it in his many books. But Wade, it is just great pleasure and a great honor to be once again sharing a splendid adventure with you. And so let me take this opportunity with the Board of Trustees. Deepak, would you please read the citation?
Future Generations Graduate School. Upon recommendation of the faculty, the Board of Trustees of Future Generations Graduate School has conferred the degree of Master of Arts in Applied Community Change and Conservation honoris causa upon Wade Davis, who is entitled to all the honors, rights, and privileges pertaining hereto. The degree is authorized by the West Virginia Higher Learning Policy Commission and accredited by the Higher Learning Commission of the North Central Association. Awarded in Washington, D.C., United States of America, on the first day of November in the year 2014. Thank you, Dan.
Well, I'm not quite used to Dan Taylor being quite so formal. You know, it is a real honor to be with you. And particularly knowing that the genesis of this incredible idea was in fact distilled at the dining room table of my house. But I must say at the time, I thought that it would never happen, as I consistently think that none of the things that Dan Taylor imagines will ever happen. But they all seem to, in some incredible way, happen. He embodies audacity. And you have to be careful because he's a great storyteller and you can get trapped in his narratives. And we were in fact on the east face of Everest one day in unseasonably snowy weather. We thought we might get trapped in the Gama Valley for the winter. And Daniel, in his inimitable way, began to speak of these Englishmen dressed in tweeds who read Shakespeare to each other in the snow at 23,000 feet on Everest. And I was completely hooked. And of course, I had no idea that that little gem he sowed in my heart would end up consuming 12 years of my life as I wrote the book Into the Silence. So I never know if I should be grateful to Daniel for that or furious at him for that. Actually, it was an act of tremendous grace. Well, all of you today, friends of future generations, and it really is a family, and Daniel loves stories, so I thought I'd start with a story that begins on a ridge in Borneo, close to dusk, with the forest alive with the electrifying sound of black cicadas. And I was sitting by a campfire with an old friend of mine, Asik Nielik, who was the headman of the Ubang River Penan, one of the last nomadic peoples of Southeast Asia. And the rain that had pounded the forest all day had let up, and the light of a moon shone through the canopy of the forest. And Asik looked from the fire to the moon, and he asked me very casually whether it was true that my people had been there. If so, why had they gone? What kind of transport had they had? And was it true that they came back with nothing but rock and dust? Well, it was difficult to explain to a man who kindled fire with flint and whose entire possessions amounted to a blowpipe, basket, and a few pets, a space program that had consumed the wealth of nations and at the cost of trillions of dollars catapulted 12 men collectively over 1 billion miles into space, or the fact that they indeed come back with nothing but rock and dust, 828 pounds of it altogether. And of course, Asik's question provoked the timeless answer. We didn't go to the moon to achieve new wealth. We went there to achieve a new vision of life itself. And the seminal moment actually came long before the Apollo landing on Christmas Eve, 1968, when Apollo went around the dark side of the moon and emerged for the first time to see not a sunrise or a moonrise, but an earthrise. And in that revelatory moment of awareness, the entire paradigm of human history shifted. That moment in time, captured in that famous frame by Bill Anders, will be spoken about for 1,000 years, because we suddenly saw that the Earth was not an infinite flatland, but a single orb, floating, as the astronauts famously said, in the velvet void of space. And almost immediately, we began to think in new ways. Just think about it. 40 years ago, just getting people to stop throwing garbage out of a car window was considered a great environmental victory. Nobody spoke of the biosphere or biodiversity. Now those terms are part of the vocabulary of school children. Like some kind of great wave of hope, this energy of illumination made possible by the space program spread everywhere. I mean, there's so many positive things have happened since that moment. If you think about it, in a single generation, women have gone from the kitchen to the boardroom, people of color from the woodshed to the White House, gay people from the closet to the altar. You know, what's not to love about a world capable of such scientific genius and indeed such cultural capacity for change and transformation, for renewal? But let me share with you one other revelation of science, equally important, and in many ways it's a space shot of your generation. It too will be remembered for 1,000 years, and it too came about as a consequence of an impossible journey, but a journey not into space, but into the very fiber of our being. Within the last 20 years, geneticists have proven it to be true, something that philosophers have always dreamt to be true, and that is that we're all brothers and sisters. And I don't mean that in the spirit of hippie ethnography. I mean, quite literally, studies of the human genome have left no doubt that it's a single continuum. Race has been exposed as an utter fiction. We are indeed all cut from the same genetic cloth. We are all children of Africa. We all, in fact, are descendants of the handful of people who walked out of Africa 65,000 years ago and then embarked on this extraordinary diaspora, 40,000 years in duration, 2,500 human generations that carried the human spirit to every corner of the habitable world. But here's the important idea. If we're all cut from the same genetic cloth, by definition, every human culture shares the same raw genius, the same mental acuity, the same human potential. And whether that potential is expressed through technological wizardry, which has been the great achievement of the West, or by contrast, placed into the challenge of unraveling the complex threads of memory inherent in a myth, is simply a matter of choice and cultural orientation. There is no evolutionary progress in the affairs of culture. The old Victorian idea that we went from the sort of the savage to the barbarian to the civilized to the Strand of London has been absolutely debunked by modern science and shown to be as much an artifact of the 19th century as the idea that clergymen had then that the earth was but 4,000 years old. And so in the stunning affirmation of the human spirit, genetics has come together to prove to be true the central revelation of cultural anthropology, which is cultural relativism. And what this means then is that the other peoples of the world, the other cultures of the world, are not failed attempts at being you, whoever you are. They're not failed attempts at being modern. Every culture of the world is by definition an answer to a fundamental question. What does it mean to be human and alive? And when the peoples of the world answer that question, they do so in the 7,000 voices of humanity that become our collective repertoire for dealing with the challenges that will confront us in the coming centuries. So what this means is very simple. Every culture has something to say, and each deserves to be heard. Now, from what I know of Daniel's father, Carl, and Daniel, this conviction lies at the very heart of the philosophy that you have followed over the course of your training at this unique and unparalleled academic opportunity and program. Seed Scale and its 4 guiding principles distill all that Daniel and his father, Carl, learned in between them over a century of hands-on work in the field of development. They had seen so much failure, but that failure that they witnessed only drove them with all greater intensity to find a way to identify the methodology of success and transformation. And that is what I think they have done with this incredible program. And that's why you are not just graduates, you are avatars, avatars of the future, avatars who will carry this methodology, this idea of thinking about community development and growth to all places on the planet. Now, as an anthropologist, I'd add only 2 caveats. As we think about culture and development, the issue is not the traditional versus the modern, but critically the rights of free people to choose the components of their lives. And the goal of anthropology is not to exclude anyone from the benefits of modernity. On the contrary, to find ways that every culture and every human being has access to the brilliance and genius of modernity, but critically without that engagement demanding the death of their ethnicity. And the reason this is so important is that culture is not trivial. Culture is not decorative. Culture is not the prayers we utter, the clothing we wear. Ultimately, culture is about a body of moral and ethical values that we place around each human being to keep at bay the barbaric heart that history sadly teaches us can lie within all of us. It is culture that allows us to make sense out of sensation, find order and meaning in the universe, to do what Abraham Lincoln said, always seek the better angels of our nature. And if you want to know, as you well do know, what happens when culture is lost, when individuals by volition or coercion turn their backs on the constraints of tradition, often aspiring to a level of affluence that will always be denied them, only to find themselves on the lowest rung of an economic ladder that goes nowhere, in a kind of sea of disaffection and alienation, you simply have to look at the points of horror around the world. Every point of conflict on earth is generated by the breakdown of culture and the conceit of cultural myopia. So that's really the great gift that Daniel has given to you. If you choose to tamper with culture, even in the slightest, even in pursuit of the most noblest of development aspirations, you must do so with wisdom and caution, precisely as you have been taught to do. And that's what makes this program so unique. Now, all of these grandiose sentiments aside, I'm sure some of you are wondering how you'll be able to leverage this knowledge in the world, how you'll be able to kind of monetize this experience. In short, will I find a job? Well, let me tell you about two friends of mine. Steve got his degree, didn't know what to do, so he went off to India and he meditated in a cave for 6 years. He knew he was in trouble when the local people started to bring him food. So he came back to America and trying to figure out what he was going to do, and naturally he meditated for 65 days. Now the person telling me this story turned to me when I asked the obvious question, what was the eureka moment? Well, the eureka moment, this fellow told me in a whisper, was vegetable protein, as if that would explain all. I had no idea what he was talking about. But what Steve had figured out was that the problem with soy milk was not the product, but the container that relegated it to the weird food section of the grocery store. So he took the product and put soy together with milk, called it silk, put it in milk cartons, insisted that it be sold in the dairy section of grocery stores, even though it didn't need to be refrigerated, and 4 years later sold his company for $295 million. And let me tell you about one other friend, Martin. Martin was a Colombian who decided he'd canoe the Rio Piraparaná in the most remote part of the northwest Amazon of Colombia. He stopped at a hut of an elder, and he noticed in this hut there was a sewing machine. And then he discovered that this Tanimuco elder had been paying off the debt of that sewing machine to a rubber baron for over 40 years. So he stopped his life, became a rubber baron, rubber merchant himself, secured fair and just prices for the local people, ended up being adopted by the Tanimucos, learning their language, getting his PhD. He came to the attention of Colombia's president, Virgilio Barco, who said to Martin, do something for the Indians. And in 5 fantastic years as head of Indian Affairs, Martin did more than something. He secured legal land tenure to an area of land collectively the size of the United Kingdom for 57 ethnicities. And behind that veil of isolation, a totally new dream of culture was born. And all of that was made possible because the power of Martin's heart. So what Steve and Martin discovered is really a universal lesson for all of us. Life is neither linear nor predictable. A career is not something that you put on like a coat. It's something that grows around you organically, step by step, gesture by gesture, experience by experience, decision by decision. Nothing is beneath you unless you make it so. Nothing is a waste of time. An elderly cab driver in New York may have as much to teach you as a sadhu in India, or even a university professor in America. But as you put yourself in the way of opportunities, you discover that you put yourself in a place where there's no choice but to move forward, no choice but success. You find yourself capable of achievements that would have been beyond your imaginings a few short months before. One thing I always learned from Daniel is that creativity is a consequence of action, not its motivation. Do what needs to be done, and then ask whether it was possible or permissible. Does not that sound like him? Pessimism is an indulgence. Orthodoxy is the enemy of invention. Despair an insult to the imagination. Nature and life loves courage. Jim Whittaker, the first American to reach the summit of Everest, once told me that if you don't live on the edge, you're taking up too much space. Dream the impossible, and here's the other great lesson of the sages and mystics of all time. Dream the impossible, and the world will not drag you down. It will, in fact, lift you up. This is a great surprise. You jump over the cliff, and you discover that you land in a feather bed. Now, many of you are, of course, worried about finding jobs, but I'd be careful with that. The word in English, job, is derived from the French medieval word gobert, meaning to devour. My father had a job all of his life. He called it the grind, and as a little boy, I thought every day Dad got a little bit shorter when he came home for work. I've never had a job like that. Actually, I've never had a job at all. But I have worked, and worked harder than anyone I know. And I think the word work has a better ring to it. It comes from the Anglo-Saxon root, meaning to create through action and deed, to inspire. And so you'll find that the work you do is just a lens through which you view and experience the world, and only for a time. The goal, and what will allow you to sustain your passions in the work that you do, the goal is to make living itself, the act of being alive, your ultimate vocation, knowing full well that nothing ultimately can be planned or anticipated no blueprint found to predict something as complex as a human life. Even as you go about bringing, monetizing, and making real the consequences of your training, if you remain always open to the potential of the new, the promise of the unimagined, other forms of magic will happen, and your life will take on even greater potency. The best things in life come to those who are incapable of compromise. It takes time for anybody to create a new world of possibilities, to imagine and bring into being something as rare, something as never existed before, which is the wonder of a full and realized life. And as you go about your work, remember the adage of Peter Matthewson, who said, anyone who thinks they can save the world is both wrong and dangerous. And of course, he had in mind people like Stalin, Hitler, and Mao. And he wasn't saying don't engage, but don't take it upon yourself to change the world or to eliminate evil in the world. As Krishna told a disciple, the reason there's evil in the world is to thicken the plot. In the end, what we must do is make a decision. What side are we going to be on? The side of light or dark, good or evil? What you have to do is bear witness to the world, realizing the process of putting your shoulder to the wheel of good, that is the destination. In the same way that the pilgrimage in Tibet is not about geography, but generating a state of mind. It is the act of the work that keeps you alive and allows you to keep going. Because in the end, money means nothing, but acts of compassion and loving kindness radiate through eternity. When I was young, living in the mountains of Colombia, a Kamsa Indian said to me something I've never forgotten. In the first years of your life, Pedro said, you live beneath the shadow of the past, too young to know what to do. In your last years, you find that you're too old to understand the world coming at you from behind. In between is a narrow beam of light that illuminates your life. And so, if you can look back on your life 40 years hence, 50 years hence, the life expectancy now of adult men on the west coast of America is 90 years old. If you can look back on a life in which you have been the owner of your own choices, there'll be no ground for resentment. Bitterness comes to those who look back with regret on choices imposed upon them. The greatest creative challenge always is a struggle to be the architect of your own life. So even as you go out into the professional world, remain patient with yourself, never compromise, and continue to give your unfolding destiny time to find you. Congratulations, and thank you for letting me be with you.